I've never really bothered with, trying to find the heart and soul of a character in a film because it always felt a little bit mushy to me.
Hold on, what do you mean?
I've never really cared if a character was likable.
How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you. You've been working on this thing for so long. How are you feeling now getting to see it in theaters and getting to watch people watch it?
I mean, my wife Mona and I that wrote the film with me, we're very, very happy with the outcome, of course, but honestly, it's just a miracle that it exists at all. So this has all been sort of icing on the cake since we actually watched the finished film for the first time. We reviewed a 70 millimeter print back in August, and I think that was the first time I'd felt a real sense of relief in almost a decade.
Have you been paying? I know it's sort of an insipid question, but have you been paying attention to the fact that people like this film a lot?
Yeah, I mean, there's a general awareness of that. My wife and I were joking about there's all of these regional critics prizes, and there were a lot of things that we'd never heard of before. My wife said, "I had no idea what we'd been losing all these years." So,
I didn't know we lost the Skokie, Illinois Critics' Choice Awards.
Exactly. So now we both feel sort of slighted.
I find your story really. I want to talk about the film in a second, but what I find interesting about learning about you, as I have been doing, which is a weird thing to say to another human, in order to get ready to do this conversation, is sort of how intentional you were about what you wanted to do when you were very young, about the roles that you chose when you were an actor and the directors you wanted to work with.
Sure.
For the very beginning, for our audience who's maybe a little bit more initiated, can you just talk to us a little bit and tell the story a little bit about how you got interested in acting and performing in the first place?
Prior to Windows 95, basically, in the early 90s, the way that the casting functioned was. Now it's all online submissions for national casting calls. But back then, there were sort of these hubs all over the United States. There was a couple in Florida. There was some in Texas, and there happened to be one in my hometown in Colorado, population 10,000. But in fact, there were all of these child actors from the Valley that I actually grew up with. There was a casting director that was based there, and also Joanna Ray was casting out of there, who cast for David Lynch and actually cast Funny Games, a film that I was in many years later. And so, my grandfather, he saw an ad in the local newspaper. It was an audition, and he was like, "Oh, you like movies?" And I was sort of a cinephile out of the womb, and he was like, "You should give it a try." And my mother, she was supportive, but she was a little apprehensive because she'd worked in advertising in Chicago in the 1980s, and her only experience with child actors was in a very sort of commercial environment, and I think she was a little spooked by the whole child actor thing. Yeah. And yet when she saw that I was taking a real interest in it, and I was working hard at it, she supported me. And I had a single mother, and I was an only child. So basically, it just sort of took on a life of its own because my family brought me to this audition, and then shortly thereafter, I ended up with a manager and an agent. I mean, I've had representation since I was 7.
Interesting.
And yet, I didn't start really focusing on it until I was, I guess, around 11 or 12. And then at that point, my mother was in a position to pick up and moved to Los Angeles for a few years. It worked for her job at the time. She was working in the mortgage industry, and she was able to work from home or wherever she wanted to. So we went to Los Angeles for a few years, and then that's when I really started working a lot.
I mean, you started doing. I mean, there are a number of roles in those sort of early days that don't fit the description of what I'm about to say, but it does seem from a very, very early age, you are much earlier than other actors who were acting at 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. You were taking very interesting, people might call them auteur director roles, Haneke, Lars von Trier, Ruben Östlund. I mean, you were getting older as these films I'm talking about.
Sure.
I was trying to, I guess I was working on what you saw, why you were drawn to these roles when other actors your age weren't. Maybe I'm beginning to wonder if it's the cinephile out of the womb thing you told me.
Yeah, I dabbled in doing a couple of things that were not so up my alley.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't very rewarding. I actually found it sort of really challenging. If I wasn't into the material, it was hard for me to do my job. And I also realized from a pretty young age that I wasn't really a natural born performer. I loved making movies. I loved, contributing, and I spent my whole life. I grew up on film sets, and that was the only way that I really could contribute when I was a young teenager, 12, 13 years old. But I realized pretty early on that this sort of one for you, one for them thing doesn't really work.
That means you get to do something for your own creative fulfillment and one for sort of commercial means.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's something that even at that age, agencies and stuff were really encouraging me to do things that I wasn't very interested in. And I quickly, came to realize that, work doesn't just beget work, but good work begets good work. And so I realized that I was only going to continue to pursue this if I was working on the kinds of projects that really mattered to me. But by the time I was 18 years old, I had already started making my own music videos and short films and things like that. And I started the process of sort of phasing it out. I just felt like I had kind of done everything that I wanted to do, and I wanted to pursue something else. What was sort of insane is that I left. I stopped performing in movies around the same time that my wife got pregnant with our daughter. And only in retrospect do we realize how truly insane it was of me to walk away from my only source of income.
Yeah, career change at that point.
Yeah. But I was so young, and I mean I was 24 when my wife was pregnant, and it just felt like the right thing to do at the time. And I realized too when I was raising money for my first film, The Childhood of a Leader, that this was a full-time job. This was not something that you could just do on the side. Mm-hmm. If I would go off and I'd work on someone else's movie for a couple of months, to lose a couple of months was, it felt like you were really, you'd lose the whole year somehow. And so I realized that the only way to really, to get this movie off the ground was to work on it, around the clock, 7 days a week. And eventually we did raise the money for that movie. And so I then shot my first film when I turned 25.
You shot your first film when you turned 25. It was a critical success. Vox Lux, we covered a few years ago. We had Natalie Portman on for it.
Oh, yeah,
she was
absolutely.
Great. And I loved that film. And as
thank
someone
you.
who sort of has an outsider view of pop music, and I do quite like it, but has a sort of wondering how much it's corrupting, the algorithms might be corrupting us.
Sure.
I got a lot out of it.
Sure.
And then so I was excited when I found out about the Brutalist, and I feel like I need to skip ahead to that a little bit just for time's sake.
Of course.
Why was László's story the one you were interested in telling?
I'd wanted to do a film on architecture for quite some time. There's surprisingly few films on the subject, actually. I mean, there's The Belly of an Architect from Peter Greenaway. There's King Vidor's adaptation of The Fountainhead.
My upstairs neighbor is an architecture professor, and when I told him about it, he was excited. He was like, "Finally, a film for us." He said The Fountainhead was actually quite good. I never saw it, but he said, "Finally, a film for us architects."
I hope I've done enough to do right by the profession. It's difficult to make a film on architecture because architecture is inanimate. So we had to think of ways not just to present architecture, but to represent architecture through the title design, the approach to the score, the cinematography, et cetera, et cetera. But I was also interested in the post-war years and had wanted to do a film on the 1950s and post-war psychology. And as brutalism came about in the 1950s, it felt to me that, post-war architecture and post-war psychology were inherently linked. And that, this brutalist monument was the perfect visual allegory to visually express, this character's trauma, which he's processing throughout the film's runtime.
Because he had to use whatever he had, because he was only left with so many materials. Because I'd love to hear.
Well, there's an extraordinary book called Architecture in Uniform from one of the great architectural scholars of the 20th century, Jean-Louis Cohen, who actually did that iconic book on Le Corbusier. That's that big coffee table tome. But Architecture in Uniform is actually something he did in collaboration with the CCA here in Canada. And it was a book about how materials that were developed for life during wartime ended up being incorporated into a lot of modernist designs in the 1950s, and it was about rebuilding, with post-war, making something from nothing, and I was really struck by the text and it really fed into, a lot of the themes that this film's wrestling with.
I understand that now. You're looking at post-war psychology, and you're looking at the architecture of the time. Those two seem to be related. I'll confess something to you, is that I thought it was a true story when I saw it.
Sure.
I left the film going, "Oh, I didn't know about that guy."
Sure.
What an interesting fella. I was soon dispelled of that, while I did try to sound as smart as I could for as long as I could. No, you guys don't know. You guys, and then I did a quick Wikipedia search, and I was wrong. But I wanted, in trying to learn more about what might have motivated you to tell the story like that, I went down the rabbit hole of your interest in the author W.G. Sebald. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Sebald, yeah.
Sebald, thank you. Who, and you might have to give us a bit of a précis here, but sort of blended history and fiction in a similar way. And I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about how you wanted to make a film about history without making a biopic or something like that.
I think that most biographies, they often feel like a Wikipedia entry. It's sort of, dates and figures, and it's cause and effect, and it's something which is, simplistic in a way and linear, and yet, I'm not so interested in that. I'm interested in, when I was making The Childhood of a Leader, I remember I described to everyone, that the film we're attempting to capture sort of ambient tyranny, which is to say that there's something in the atmosphere which contributes to this, this character's evolution.
This kid becoming a fascist leader.
Exactly. Well, there's in Camus' iconic book, The Stranger, in the final interrogation sequence, this character is pressed, on his motive. Why did you pull the trigger? And he finally comes undone and says, it was hot out that day and the sun was in my eyes and I was agitated because my neighbor had upset me earlier that morning. It comes out like a leak, all of these contributing factors that made him do what this unspeakable thing. And yet it's really quite banal in a way. And so I realized when I read that that we're always looking for sort of quite morally simplistic solutions for, like how we got here. And I think that there's a level of nuance that, a film can capture a feeling for history, which is somehow, perhaps more effective than just chronicling, the Battle of Waterloo.
It's really interesting to me, though. I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that because the word I'm dancing around there is accurate. Like it almost feels like a fictional film about history. In this case, about an immigrant coming to America, escaping the Holocaust, trying to find his way through, having this toxic benefactor.
Sure.
Is the word you're looking around there accurate? Like it can portray an accurate perspective of a historical time?
I would say a more complete one. I would say
fiction. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is because I feel more transported by the works of Robert Musil and V.S. Naipaul than I do, most biographies, or certainly biopics, which feels just like you got to play all the hits,
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm interested in the in between, and virtual history allows me to also, to not insult the estate. So I'm only I'm able to freely explore the themes that I'm interested in, and don't feel that I need to treat a real person and their family with some sense of slavish respect.
I spoke to Adrien Brody about the film, and I had prepared this big chat with him about something I love talking about, which is art versus commerce, which is or art and commerce. How
Sure.
So many of the things that we need to make, and so much of the art that I love, whether it's transgressive or not, does have someone behind it, and there is a relationship with someone, cashing the checks and writing the checks. You know what he said to me? He said, "That's Brady's story. That's Brady's story in making this film." I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us what he meant.
The partners that we had on this film were extraordinary. I think everyone that was on board early was with us at the end, which is kind of unusual. Normally, you have someone drops out.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. It's very rare that you finish a movie with whoever you started with.
Right.
Actually, but in this case, we really had really great partners. But of course, I have worked on many projects where we had really, toxic relationships with the powers that be, and I struggled with that. It was very difficult for me to know. I know that my job as the filmmaker is to protect the flame of the project, but at what cost? I mean, because when you find yourself working with someone for sometimes years that has very different morals and ethics than you do, it's really confronting in a way. And if you follow the money behind most major streamers, studios, financiers, it usually leads you to some place that's not great.
A little gross pretty quickly.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that most artists, really identify with, and that relationship between the patron and the artist is something that's very complicated because really, who gets the tie break? Is it the person that's paying for it, or is it the person who's actually made the damn thing? And this is always it's a tale as old as time. But the relationship between an architect and their client is a notoriously frustrating one. Or frustrated one.
Tell me a story about directing Adrien.
My sort of philosophy about the character was that it was very important to me that to portray a survivor that's not an altruist, because I've seen so many survivor stories and where these characters are angels, and I struggle with that because I think it suggests that we can only empathize with someone if they're perfect. And so for me, it was important that this character was an absolute mess.
Yeah, László just struggles with his wife, struggles with drugs.
Struggles with addiction, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yet, when I met Adrien, I felt this sort of this warmth, that he exudes. Like he's a pretty poetic guy in real life, and I was really moved by him the first time that we met, and it's actually something I think I'll probably carry with me for a long time. That I've never really bothered with trying to find the heart and soul of a character in a film, because it always felt a little bit mushy to me. But in fact, I now
Hold on. What do you mean?
I just I've never been a sentimentalist, and I've only ever been preoccupied with a character being fascinating and compelling. It's never been I've never really cared if a character was likable, and yet this was the first time that I had a likable protagonist in a film. Because you couldn't help but like Adrien. I mean, he's just this beautiful guy. And I actually think it's one of the reasons that the people are really, really connecting with the film, because it's a 3.5-hour movie about a mid-century designer with a baked-in intermission, and it's large format. I mean, it's a really radical movie. But I think that what's really working for so many viewers is that the Adrien just breaks your heart in the role, and so does Felicity, and I mean the whole ensemble is just fantastic. And so, it's interesting. I'll definitely carry it with me.
You're looking to more towards the interior, the likability,
the interior, the warmth.
Yeah.
To find it somewhere. It doesn't necessarily need to be with your protagonist, but I now feel, moving forward that I'll probably find some, place for it at the table.
I've been watching your interviews, getting ready for this, and one thing that I was hesitant to bring up is sort of like, what do you want this film to say? What do you want this film to do?
Sure.
I can't think of many pieces of art that I've loved that have been made with that in mind.
Sure.
That being said, and I also want to acknowledge you've been making this film for how long now?
7 years.
7 years.
Yeah.
So the time you started making it is very different than the time is coming out. That being said, here in Canada and in the United States, and really everywhere right now in the UK, I mean, kind of everywhere, there is immigration is on people's minds.
Yeah, it's top of mind.
It's top of mind. This is ultimately, you've said, an immigrant story. So I guess what I want to know is, how are you feeling about your film coming out and sort of meeting this time?
I truly believe that it would have been relevant at any time. I mean, it feels perhaps especially heightened right now, but the reality is, when you're choosing a project, you're attached to a project for so many years. I mean, most movies are 3 or 4 years, but even that's a pretty long time.
Yeah.
And so you really have to choose themes that will never not be relevant. It occurred to me that it could take a very long time to get this movie off the ground, and yet we're all the sons and grandsons and granddaughters and daughters of immigrants, and we all come from somewhere, and so of course I imagine that people would feel a connection to that of being one of the film's central themes at any point.
As someone who is so motivated by the uncompromising nature of making great art, how are you dealing with the critical and popular acclaim part of this thing? How are you dealing with the Oscar nomination-y stuff? Are you able to isolate yourself from that and not feel it?
Well, to be honest, I think that just being a part of that conversation for so many months has already kind of done what it's needed to do for the film, in the sense that, it's it's helped our distributors to successfully mainstream a film that many people, as recently as 6 or 7 months ago, were telling me was undistributable. And so
I'm not hearing a lot of personal validation in there, to be fair.
Yeah. So, I just feel, I think it's important to, if you believe the good stuff, you have to believe the bad stuff too. I really try to tune out the noise to the best of my ability because, I don't make movies to win awards I mean, that's not why I do what I do at all. I really appreciate that critical acclaim and these awards campaigns generate interest in the projects, and it helps to sell movie tickets, which in turn makes my next projects, my wife's next projects, more viable. And so, I'm very, very grateful for the reaction, but I mean, I can safely say that it's not gone to my head.
I can tell you, it's only going to get worse from here. It's only going to get more from here. It's a truly beautiful movie.
I really appreciate it, and thanks for this discussion.
Thanks for coming in.